The silence in Caleb Whitmore's house had a weight to it, the kind that pressed against the walls and settled into the floorboards and made the air feel thick and unbreathable, like the atmosphere inside a sealed room where something had been left to decay. It was not the silence of peace or of rest. It was the silence of a man who had forgotten that he had a voice, who had let the weeks fold into months and the months fold into a year, without uttering anything beyond the bare minimum required to keep a ranch operational. Feed the horses, move the herd, fix the fence on the north pasture. These were the only sentences left to him, clipped and functional, spoken to his foreman and to no one else, because there was no one else to speak to. His wife, Clara, had been buried on the hill behind the house 14 months ago, taken by a fever that had moved through the valley like a swift and indifferent wind, choosing its victims without logic or mercy. She had been gone in 4 days, 4 days from the first flush of heat on her cheek to the cold, still morning when Caleb had sat beside her in the gray light and understood, with a finality that had cracked something deep and load-bearing inside him, that she was not coming back. The house showed it. Every room was a monument to a life interrupted. Clara's mending basket still sat beside the parlor chair, the needle threaded with blue wool, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment and would return to finish the work. The curtains she had sewn from flour sacks and dyed a pale yellow hung in the windows, now faded and dust-filmed, their cheerful color muted to something closer to ash. The kitchen was the worst of it. Caleb had no gift for cooking and no patience to acquire one. He ate what he could manage, which amounted to a grim rotation of fried salt pork, boiled potatoes, and coffee that was more sludge than liquid. He burned things frequently, and without remorse, scraping the char from the pan with a knife and eating what remained, because eating was a mechanical necessity, like oiling a hinge. His daughter, Rose, was 9 years old and had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's way of watching a room as if she were memorizing it for later. She had been quiet since Clara died, not in the way of a child who had retreated into herself, but in the way of a child who had decided that the world required careful observation before it could be trusted again. She ate what her father put in front of her, without complaint. She did her schoolwork at the kitchen table by lamplight. She brushed her own hair and braided it herself each morning, the braid slightly uneven, slightly too tight on one side, and Caleb would look at it and feel something move through him that was too large and too formless to be called guilt, and too specific and too sharp to be called anything else. He had tried, in the early months, to hold the domestic world together through sheer determination, as if grief were simply another fence to be mended, another field to be cleared. He had failed, quietly and completely, in ways that were visible only to those who looked closely. The hem of Rose's school dress had come undone, and he had not known how to repair it, so she wore it trailing for 3 weeks, until the school teacher, a kind woman named Mrs. Albright, had quietly taken it in one afternoon and returned it without comment. The bread he attempted was dense and unleavened, more suitable for use as a doorstop than for eating. The vegetables in Clara's kitchen garden went to seed, and then to ruin, because he did not have the knowledge or the time to tend them. And watching them die felt like losing something of hers again. So he stopped looking at the garden altogether and let the weeds take it. He was a man of considerable competence in the world of land and livestock and weather, and he was completely, humiliatingly lost in the world of his own home. By the time autumn came around again, he had stopped trying to pretend otherwise. He hired out the cooking to a neighbor woman for a few weeks, but she had her own household to manage, and the arrangement fell apart. He placed a notice with the postmaster in the town of Harrow Creek, a simple and unadorned statement of need. A housekeeper was wanted for the Whitmore ranch, room and board and a fair wage, a woman of good character and practical skills. He did not mention Rose. He did not mention himself. He folded the notice and handed it over and rode home without looking back, because looking back at things had become a habit he could not afford. Nora Beale arrived on the Thursday stage from Billings with a canvas bag, a wooden crate containing a cast-iron skillet and a set of good knives, and the particular self-contained composure of a woman who had learned not to expect anyone to be waiting for her. She was 34 years old, plain-faced and capable-looking, with light brown hair that she wore pinned up in a practical knot, and hands that told the story of her life more clearly than any words could. They were strong hands, reddened at the knuckles, with short nails and the faint silvery marks of old burns on the right palm from years of working close to a hot stove. She had been a wife once, briefly, to a man named Thomas Beale, who had died of a riding accident 2 years prior, leaving her with a small debt and a smaller farm that the bank had subsequently absorbed with the impersonal efficiency of a large organism consuming a small one. She had worked since then as a cook in a boarding house in Billings, a position that had been adequate in the way that adequate things are, sufficient for survival and insufficient for anything resembling a life. When she had seen the notice at the postmaster's office, copied out by hand on a small card and pinned to the board beside notices for lost mules and parcels awaiting collection, she had read it twice, removed the pin, and slipped the card into her coat pocket. She was not a woman given to impulsive decisions, but she recognized the shape of an opportunity when she encountered one, and she had been waiting for a shape like this for longer than she cared to count. Caleb Whitmore was waiting at the edge of town, not because he was eager, but because it was the practical thing to do, and practicality was the only organizing principle he had left. He stood beside his wagon with his hat in his hand and watched the woman climb down from the stage with her canvas bag and her wooden crate, and he noted, without particular feeling, that she was exactly what her notice had implied: plain, steady, and entirely unimpressed by her own arrival. She looked at the town, then at him, with a directness that was not aggressive, but simply honest, the gaze of a person who had decided long ago that the world was better navigated with clear eyes than with optimistic ones. He told her his name. She told him hers. He took the wooden crate and loaded it into the wagon bed, and she climbed onto the seat without assistance or comment, and they drove the 11 miles to the ranch in a silence that was, if not comfortable, at least mutually comprehensible. He pointed out the boundaries of the land as they passed through them, more from habit than from any expectation that she would find the information interesting. She listened, or appeared to, her gaze moving steadily across the landscape with the same assessing quality she had turned on the town. When the ranch house came into view on its slight rise above the valley floor, she looked at it for a long moment without speaking. He waited for some reaction, some flicker of dismay at the peeling paint, or the sway of the porch, or the general air of a place that had been maintained in body, but not in spirit. She said nothing. She simply looked, and then she looked away. And he found, to his faint surprise, that her silence was not the silence of disappointment, but of assessment. She was taking inventory. She was deciding where to begin. She began in the kitchen. This was not a decision she announced or explained. She simply set her canvas bag in the small room off the back of the house that he showed her, and then she tied on her apron and walked into the kitchen and stood in the center of it for a moment with her hands at her sides, taking in the cold stove top and the stack of tin plates and the half-empty sack of flour with the weevils working their slow, industrious paths along its edge. She did not sigh. She opened the back door to let in the air, which came in cold and smelling of pine and turned earth, and she began. She was still working when Caleb came in from the evening chores, and the kitchen was different. Not transformed, not yet, but oriented differently, as if someone had taken a room that had been facing the wrong direction and turned it gently toward the light. The stove top was clean. The weevil-compromised flour had been sorted, and the good portion set aside in a sealed crock. A pot of something was simmering on the stove, and the smell of it was so foreign to the recent history of the kitchen, so fundamentally and specifically the smell of food prepared by someone who knew what food was supposed to taste like, that Caleb stopped in the doorway and stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Rose was sitting at the table, and she was not doing her schoolwork. She was watching Nora move around the kitchen with the particular focused attention she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting. The meal was simple. Beans cooked with the ham hock she had found in the smokehouse, cornbread made with the salvaged flour, a handful of late wild onions she had found growing along the fence line when she had gone to retrieve a bucket from the yard. It was not an elaborate meal. It was a real one, which was something different. Caleb ate 2 portions, and Rose ate everything on her plate, and then sat quietly, looking at the empty dish with an expression that Caleb recognized with a slow and painful clarity as relief. He looked at his daughter and felt the familiar formless thing move through him again. But this time, it was accompanied by something else, something that had not been present in a long time. It was something close to shame, and beneath the shame, something closer still to gratitude. He did not say any of this. He was not a man who had ever found words to be a reliable tool for the expression of internal states, and in the past 14 months, he had let even his limited vocabulary of feeling fall further into disuse until it had atrophied almost entirely. He pushed back from the table and said that supper was good. It was the most words he had spoken in a single sentence, in longer than he could accurately recall. And they were the right words, and they cost him something to say. And he was aware of all 3 of these facts simultaneously as he carried his plate to the basin and walked back out into the evening, where the air was cold and the stars were very clear, and the silence was the outside kind, which was the only kind he had been able to bear for a long time. In the days that followed, Nora Beale remade the Whitmore household with the same quiet efficiency that she brought to everything, working from the inside out, room by room, in an order that followed some internal logic of priority that Caleb could not always follow but came to recognize as sound. She scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees, and then sealed the wood with a mixture she made from beeswax and linseed oil that left the grain warm and honey-colored, the way it must have looked when the house was new. She washed the faded yellow curtains and rehung them, and though the washing did not restore their original color, the clean fabric let in more light, and the rooms seemed to breathe differently for it. She found Clara's mending basket beside the parlor chair, and she moved it gently to a shelf in the back room, not discarding it, not erasing it, but simply relocating it from the center of the living space to a place where it was present, but not demanding. Caleb noticed this and said nothing, but something in him that had been held in a particular position, a position of braced and aching awareness of everything that had not been touched, eased very slightly, like a muscle releasing after a long contraction. With Rose, she was patient in the specific way of a woman who understood that a child's trust was not a thing that could be requested or accelerated, but only earned slowly through consistent and unhurried proof of reliability. She did not try to be the girl's friend or her mother or anything other than what she was, which was an adult woman who was present and competent and not going anywhere. She showed Rose how to plait bread dough and how to press the air out of a pie crust and how to tell by the sound of a simmering pot whether the heat needed adjusting. She asked the girl's opinion on small domestic decisions, which herb to add to the stew, which of the two chipped mugs was better suited to morning coffee, in a way that treated her observations as genuinely useful rather than merely charming. Rose began to speak more, not in great rushes of language, but in the slow, incremental way of a person who has decided that speech is worth the risk. She told Nora about her teacher, Mrs. Albright, and about the book she was reading, and about the name she had given to the barn cat, who was called Sergeant on account of his imperious manner. Nora listened to all of it with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and Rose, who had a 9-year-old's acute sensitivity to the quality of adult listening, knew that she was being genuinely heard, and this knowledge did something quiet and significant to the guarded posture she had been holding since her mother died. Caleb watched all of this from a distance that was partly physical and partly habitual. He came in for meals and ate them and went back out to work. He was not unkind to Nora. He was simply absent in the way of a man who had spent over a year constructing an interior architecture of distance, room after room of it, until the inhabited part of himself had shrunk to a very small and very defended space. He noticed the changes she made to the house. He noticed the way Rose sat differently at the table, with her shoulders lower and her face less careful. He noticed that the kitchen smelled the way kitchens were supposed to smell, and that the coffee was good, and that the firewood was always stacked beside the stove in the morning in a way that told him she had been up before him, tending to things. He left a pail of fresh milk on the back step each morning, a wordless acknowledgement that her work was seen. She used the milk to make a custard one Sunday that was so precisely the kind of thing Clara used to make on Sundays that Caleb excused himself from the table abruptly and did not return for some time. And when he came back, his face was composed, and he said nothing, and she said nothing. But she did not make the custard again, and he understood, without needing to examine the understanding too closely, that she had noticed and had adjusted. And this small act of consideration struck him as one of the most decent things anyone had done for him in a very long time. The trouble arrived, as trouble tended to in a small town, wearing the face of concern. Edith Marsh was the wife of Harrow Creek's most successful grain merchant, a woman whose social position had given her both the inclination and the opportunity to appoint herself the unofficial moral auditor of the community. She was not malicious in the simple sense. She was the more complicated, and therefore more dangerous, kind of trouble, the kind that believed sincerely in its own righteousness, that had constructed an internal narrative in which its interference was an act of charity and its judgment was an act of love. She arrived at the Whitmore ranch on a Tuesday in a buggy driven by her hired man, dressed in her visiting clothes, which were considerably finer than anything Nora owned, and she brought with her a pie as a pretext and an agenda as her actual purpose. Nora opened the door and took the pie with genuine thanks and offered coffee, and Edith Marsh came inside and sat at the clean kitchen table and looked around at the orderly, warm room with an expression that was not quite a frown, but occupied the same neighborhood. She asked about Nora's background with the particular politeness that functions as a form of interrogation, each question posed with a solicitous tilt of the head that did not quite conceal the assessment beneath. Where had she come from? Had she family in the area? What had brought her to this part of Montana rather than remaining in Billings, where there must surely have been opportunities for a woman of her? Here Edith Marsh paused in a way that was itself a judgment. Her abilities. Nora answered each question with a plainness that offered nothing extra, the verbal equivalent of a closed door that was nonetheless politely hinged. She had worked in Billings. She had seen the notice. She had come because the position suited her circumstances. Edith Marsh listened to all of this with a smile that did not reach her eyes, and then set down her coffee cup and said, with the careful delicacy of a woman placing a knife on a table rather than putting it away, that she hoped Mr. Whitmore understood the importance of maintaining appearances, particularly for the sake of the child, and that a man in his position, a widower of some standing in the community, might wish to consider more formal arrangements if he intended a woman to remain in his household on a permanent basis, and that she herself would be delighted to assist in finding a more, here another pause, appropriate solution if the current arrangement proved unsatisfactory to the community's standards of propriety. Nora said, quietly and without heat, that she was the housekeeper, that she had been hired to cook and clean and care for the child, and that she could not speak to the community standards, but could speak to the quality of her work, which Mr. Whitmore was in a better position than anyone to assess. Edith Marsh left shortly afterward, the pie unsliced on the table, and Nora cleared the coffee cups and washed them and put them away, and did not mention the visit to Caleb when he came in that evening. But Harrow Creek was a small town, and Edith Marsh had a wide acquaintance, and within a week the whisper had moved through the community like smoke through a keyhole, finding every gap and crack, suggesting without stating, implying without accusing, performing the ancient and efficient work of gossip with the practiced ease of long habit. Caleb became aware of it on a Friday, when he went into town for supplies, and found that the quality of the silence that greeted him at Henderson's general store was different from the usual kind. It was a watchful silence, a silence with an edge to it, and he understood its meaning in the way that a man who has lived in a small community for his entire adult life understands such things, immediately and in his bones, without needing it explained. He bought his supplies and rode home. And that evening he sat at the kitchen table, long after Rose had gone to bed, and Nora had retired to her room, sat there with his cold coffee and the familiar weight of the house around him, and he thought about what was being said in the town, and what it meant, and what, if anything, he was going to do about it. He was not an articulate man. He did not have a large or flexible vocabulary for the internal life, but he knew what was right and what was not. And he knew, with the slow and certain knowledge of a man who has been paying attention even when he appeared not to be, what Nora Beale had brought to his house and to his daughter, and to the ruins of his own daily existence. He knew what it had cost her to arrive here with her canvas bag and her wooden crate and her composed and careful face, and he knew what she had built in the months since, quietly and without complaint, and without ever once asking to be thanked for it. He sat with all of this for a long time. And then he went to bed. And in the morning he did something he had not done in 14 months. He talked. It began at breakfast. Rose had gone to school, and the kitchen was quiet, and Nora was washing the breakfast dishes, when Caleb said, without preamble and without looking up from his coffee, that he had heard the talk in town. Nora's hands continued their work in the basin. She said she expected he had. He said he wanted her to know that he did not hold with it, the talk, and that he considered it nobody's business, but his own what arrangements he made in his own house. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 20 seconds, which, in the context of Caleb Whitmore's conversational history, was approximately equivalent to a speech. Then he said that he had forgotten how to speak for a long time after Clara died, that it had seemed pointless talking because the person he had wanted to talk to was gone, and talking to anyone else felt like using the wrong instrument for the task, like trying to write with a fence post. He looked at his hands around the coffee cup. He said that he was aware he had not been much of a presence in the house or for Rose, and that he was aware this was not adequate, but that he had not known, until recently, how to be otherwise. Nora dried her hands on her apron and sat down across from him, not in the way of someone preparing to respond, but in the way of someone who understood that what was happening required a witness rather than an answer. He talked for 20 minutes. It was not a fluid or eloquent 20 minutes. It was halting and repetitive in places, and occasionally arrived at a sentence that simply stopped before it found its conclusion, leaving the thought hanging in the air between them like something partially constructed. He talked about Clara, about her laugh, which had been the kind of laugh that made other people in a room want to know what was funny. He talked about the 4 days of the fever, and the way time had moved during those days, too fast and too slow simultaneously, and how he had sat beside her bed on the last night holding her hand and had talked to her, had talked more in those hours than he had in the weeks prior, trying to put into words all the things he had meant to say and had not, because there had always seemed to be time, because you did not account for the possibility that there would not be time, and then there was not. He stopped. He looked at the table. He said that after, he hadn't seen the point of words anymore, that he had let them go, one by one, until there were almost none left. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she told him about Thomas. Not the accident, not the bank, not the boarding house. She told him about the particular loneliness of being competent, of being the person who kept things running, who knew how to do the necessary things, and of how that competence could become a kind of cage. Because if you were good at managing on your own, then the world assumed you preferred it, assumed you did not need the things that other people needed, a company and softness, and the sound of another person moving through the same space as you. She said she had forgotten what it was like to be in a house where someone else was also present, really present, until she had come here. He looked at her when she said this. It was the first time, she thought, that he had looked at her directly in all the weeks she had been there, looked at her as a person rather than as a functional element of the household. It lasted only a moment, and then he looked away again, but something had shifted, some small tectonic adjustment in the interior architecture he had built, and she felt it as surely as she would have felt a change in the weather. After that, he talked more, not dramatically, not in great revelatory floods, but in the way of a man cautiously relearning a skill he had believed lost, testing the weight of it, finding that it held. He would come in from the fields in the evening and say something about the day, the behavior of a particular steer, the progress on the fence line, the quality of the light on the mountains at dusk, which had been, he mentioned once, almost casually, the kind of light that Clara had liked to sit outside and watch. He began to ask Nora questions, not the interrogative kind, not the kind that required accounting, but the genuinely curious kind, about how she had learned to cook the way she did, about what Billings was like, about whether she had found the Montana winters to be as different from the eastern winters of her childhood as he had always heard they were. She answered all of it with the same directness she brought to everything, and she asked her own questions in return, and the evenings in the kitchen began to have a texture they had not had before, a back and forth of language that was nothing like eloquence, but was, in its own plain way, something better. It was communication. It was two people making themselves known to each other through the gradual and patient work of honest speech. Rose noticed. Children who have been quiet and watchful tend to notice everything. And Rose Whitmore had been very quiet and very watchful for 14 months. She began to linger at the supper table after her meal was finished, contributing occasional observations of her own to the conversation, testing the waters, finding them safe, venturing further. She told Nora about a book her teacher had lent her, and Nora asked about it, and Caleb, who had not talked to his daughter about books in over a year, asked about it also. And Rose looked at him with an expression of such open surprise and pleasure that he had to look away for a moment, and when he looked back, she was already answering, her hands animated, her voice carrying the particular energy of a child who has been given permission to be fully present. These evenings accumulated, one upon the next, and the house that had been a monument to interrupted life became something else, something still imperfect, and still marked by what it had lost, but alive in a way it had not been, warm in the particular way that is produced not by heat alone, but by the presence of people who are genuinely attending to one another. The formal difficulty with the town came to a head on a Sunday in early January, at the church social that Mrs. Albright, Rose's teacher, organized each year as a gesture of community cohesion. Caleb had not attended a social event of any kind since Clara's death, and he would not have attended this one, except that Rose had been asked to recite a poem she had memorized, and the recitation was important to her, and the importance of things that were important to Rose had become, in recent months, a weight he found he could not set down. He asked Nora if she would come. He did not frame it as a request exactly. He said that it would be right for her to come, and that he wanted her there. She put on her good dress, the dark green wool that was not fancy but was clean and well fitted, and she came. Edith Marsh was there, of course, stationed near the refreshment table with two of her intimates, and when Caleb walked in with Rose on one side and Nora on the other, the quality of attention in the room shifted in the way of rooms that have been waiting for a particular thing to happen. Rose went to join her school friends, and Caleb and Nora stood near the door, and Edith Marsh detached herself from her group and came toward them with the expression of a woman who has been composing her remarks for some time. She said, loudly enough to be heard by the surrounding cluster of people, that it was lovely to see Caleb out, and what a thoughtful arrangement it was to bring the housekeeper along to an occasion like this, so she could see how things were done in polite society. The words were aimed at Nora with the precision of long practice, and they landed, and the room heard them land, and there was a moment of the particular collective held breath that precedes a scene. Caleb turned and looked at Edith Marsh. He was not a man who had ever had much use for scenes, and he was not going to have one now. He said, in a voice that was not raised but was extremely clear, that he was glad she had raised the subject because he had something to say on it, and he would prefer to say it once rather than have it travel through the town piecemeal and arrive at people's ears in a form he had not intended. He said that Nora Beale had come to his household when it was in a poor state and had restored it, through her own competence and her own character, to something that deserved to be called a home. He said that his daughter was well fed and well cared for, and happier than she had been in over a year, and that he himself was in better condition than he had any right to expect, and that all of this was a direct result of Nora Beale's presence. He said that he had asked her to marry him, which was not entirely true at the precise moment he said it, as he had not yet asked, but which became true in his mind as he said it, with the particular clarity of a man who understands something fully only in the act of articulating it. He said he hoped the community would extend to her the same respect they extended to any woman of good character, because that was precisely what she was, and that he would consider any further speculation on the subject to be an affront, not to his housekeeper, but to his future wife. The room was very quiet. Edith Marsh's expression cycled through several states in rapid succession before settling on something that resembled dignified retreat. She said that she was sure they all wished Mr. Whitmore every happiness, and her two intimates murmured assent. And then Rose, who had appeared at Nora's elbow at some point during the speech, took Nora's hand in both of her small ones and held it. And Nora looked down at the girl and felt something in her chest open like a window in spring, and she did not trust herself to speak. So she simply stood and held the child's hand and let the moment be what it was. He asked her properly that evening, after Rose was in bed. They were in the kitchen, where everything important in this house had happened, at the table with the lamp between them. He said he had meant what he had said in the church. He said he was aware that he was not easy company, that he was a man who had only recently relearned how to use words and could not guarantee fluency, that the ranch was a great deal of work and the winters were long, and the nearest town was 11 miles of bad road. He said all of this plainly and without embellishment, as if he were presenting her with a true accounting of the asset before she decided whether to purchase it. And then he said that he wanted her to stay, not because of what she did, though what she did had been the saving of him and of his daughter, and he would not pretend otherwise, but because of what she was. Because she was honest and steady and kind in the particular way that did not require an audience, the kind that showed itself in small acts performed when no one was watching, and because the house that she had made was a house he wanted to live in for the rest of his life, and he could not imagine living in it without her. He looked at her across the lamp. He said her name, Nora. He said it as if it were something he had been given, and was only now understanding the value of. She said yes. She said it simply and without hesitation, not because she had not thought about it. She had thought about it for some time, but because the thinking had already been done and the answer had been waiting, and there was no reason to make a ceremony of stating what was already, in every way that mattered, true. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and his hand was large and rough and warm, and she turned hers over and held it, and they sat like that for a while, in the lamplight with the winter pressing cold against the windows and the fire ticking in the hearth, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence, because it was the right kind of silence now, the kind that did not press against the walls or settle like ash, but held them gently, like something that had learned how to be at rest. They were married in the front parlor 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when the snow was clean on the ground and the light was the particular pale gold of a Montana winter that has decided, briefly, to be generous. Mrs. Albright came, and Henderson from the general store, and Caleb's foreman, a quiet man named Dutch, who had worked the ranch for 11 years and expressed his approval of the union by arriving with his hat brushed and his boots polished, which was more ceremony than he had offered any occasion in recent memory. Rose stood between them in her best dress, with her braid done neatly for once, because Nora had done it for her that morning, and she looked from her father to Nora, and back with an expression of concentrated satisfaction, as if she were observing the correct solution to a problem she had been working on for some time. The justice of the peace said the words, and they said the words back, and afterward there was a meal that Nora had cooked the day before, and only needed warming, a roast and preserves and bread and a cake that Rose had helped to make. And they sat around the table and ate and talked, and Caleb talked more than anyone present had ever heard him talk, about the spring planting and the north pasture and the plans he had for the porch roof. And Dutch listened and nodded, and Mrs. Albright asked questions, and Rose contributed opinions on all subjects with the authority of someone who had recently rediscovered that her opinions were welcome. And Nora sat beside her husband and ate her cake and listened to all of it, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, that she was not passing through a place, but living in one. The winter deepened, and then slowly, in the way of things that seem permanent until they are not, it began to relent. The days lengthened by increments too small to observe on any given day, but undeniable in accumulation. The light returning to the valley in the particular tentative way of a thing that has been away and is not yet sure of its welcome. Inside the Whitmore house, the change that had begun in the kitchen on a cold October evening when Nora Beale had set her canvas bag down and tied on her apron continued its slow and patient work. The rooms were warm and ordered, and they smelled of bread and coffee and the beeswax that Nora used on the floors. And in the evenings the lamp burned steadily at the kitchen table, and the fire held in the hearth. And Rose did her schoolwork, and Caleb talked, not always about important things, not always about things that cost him anything to say, but steadily, consistently, in the way of a man who has rediscovered a faculty he had believed lost and finds that it functions better the more it is used. He talked about the ranch and the weather, and the book Rose was reading, and the memory of a spring roundup 20 years ago, when he had been 19, and full of the particular confidence that belongs to young men who have not yet been tested. He talked about small things and large things, and things that mattered, and things that did not. And Nora listened to all of it, and sometimes she talked back, and sometimes she simply sat with him in the warm kitchen and let the sound of his voice be the thing that it was, which was the sound of a man who had come back to himself, slowly and with difficulty, and in the company of someone steady enough to make the return feel possible. The silence that remained in the house was not the old silence, the dead and pressing kind. It was the other kind, the kind that meant everything was all right, the kind that two people make together without trying, simply by being, at last, and without reservation, home.